You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Welcome back to the Max Planck Lawcast. Today we're going to be delving into a topic that has shaped societies for millennia, but we've actually never covered it on the Lawcast before, and that's the topic of religion. Now, I could probably fill countless episodes by talking about religion on the Lawcast, but rather than doing that, we're going to be focusing on a particularly interesting case study, and that is the rise of Evangelical Christianity in Latin America. Throughout this episode, we're going to be examining how this dynamic religious movement has influenced politics, culture, and social issues in the region, and explore a little bit more deeply the interplay between faith, governance, and the law. Now, I must admit that before today's episode, when I first heard about the topic, I was actually taken back. I was a little surprised or perplexed because I'd always kind of placed evangelical Christianity primarily at home in the United States. However, I quickly learnt that south of the border in Latin America, the evangelical movement has been gathering steam and has been rapidly growing in both size and political importance. Indeed, evangelicalism has now become a major player in shaping public policy and cultural attitudes across Latin America. To tell us more about this fascinating topic, I'm joined today by René Urueña. René is a well-known scholar of international and Latin American law, and he's played a crucial role in developing a Latin American brand of human rights. Moreover, René is a Max Planck Law Fellow who has published numerous works on the topic of religion and human rights. René, welcome to the Lawcast.
Chris, thank you so much for having me. Very, very happy to be here.
Yeah, and you're actually joining us today from Bogota. Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. So, as I said before in my introduction, I was researching the topic today. I was really surprised to find that the number of evangelical worshippers in Latin America is almost 20% of the region's population, and the number is actually growing rapidly. Could you maybe give us a brief historical understanding of the growth of evangelicalism in Latin America?
Yeah, so in general, Protestantism arrived in Latin America very early in the 19th century or so, and even before. But until the 1960s or 70s, they were pretty marginal because the whole region was pretty Catholic. And of course, Protestants were perceived as the enemy. So you had Freemasons, you had Protestants, and you have atheists, and all these were the enemies, obviously, of the Catholic Church. And you would have all around the region really very strong Catholic influence denouncing Protestants as, well, basically the religious enemy. But that changed, and that changed early in the 1960s, and particularly in the context of the Cold War. Well, because in the Cold War, you had all these evangelical movements in the US that was distinctively anti-communist. And then through that, of course, anti-communist was also a very important part of the interaction between the US and Latin America. And then through this kind of expansion of anti-communism, then, of course, Latin America became also a site of interest for evangelicals. And so that's why in the 1960s and 70s, you really start seeing more and more evangelicalism popping out in Latin America.
That was coming down from North America and from the US.
From the US, exactly. So you had, on the one hand, in Latin America, kind of the more historical or traditional Protestant churches, like the Baptists or Anabaptism that had been here in Latin America, for basically a century and a half or 2 centuries, but they were politically marginal and they had been persecuted by the Catholic majority. So that's on the one hand. But then on the other hand, what you had is in the 60s and 70s, and very fast after the 70s, you had this new branch of charismatic evangelical Protestantism that was kind of absent earlier on. And then it was this branch of evangelical Protestantism that really caught fire very, very fast. And particularly this branch of charismatic evangelicalism. And then this other dimension originally was very deeply tied to anti-communism and so Cold War mentality. But really, when it got to Latin America, it went way beyond that. It became part of the culture in Latin America, and very early in the 1980s, and particularly after the 1990s, you had an expansion, a very, very quick expansion of this branch of evangelicalism that goes well beyond anything that could be framed in terms of Cold War or anti-communism.
The numbers would show that it's been almost explosive.
It's exponential, Chris. And it's exponential in two senses. So the first one is it's exponential because it's really a bottom-up movement. So it's while a lot of the vocabulary can be tied to U.S. American megachurches, it isn't a transplant as such. A lot of the vocabulary, a lot of the experience, it's very similar. So there's no doubt about that. But this is not a top-down transplant. It's really something that is bottom-up. It's really something that is organic. And in that sense, because it's organic, because it's, children first bring in their parents, then their parents bring in their grandparents, and then the families. And there's this whole thing at different levels of socioeconomic income. So it's grown very, very fast. And it provides not only a spiritual experience, but also a social experience, a whole, life experience for those who participate. And in that sense, people really do live their lives, many of them, not all of them, obviously, but many of them really do live their lives within the logic of the church. And then that becomes, of course, very important. So it's exponential. It's very important. And it's not done in terms of numbers. Maybe later on we can talk a bit more about the second dimension, which is it's also a very intense experience. In some of the papers that I think we can link them in the podcast note, I make reference to some statistics and to some surveys that give a sense of how intense the experience is. So it's not only that there are a lot of people who define themselves as evangelicals, but also that the people who define themselves as evangelicals, a very big portion of those people say that being evangelical and the religious experience is a fundamental part of their life. So it's very intense. Unlike Catholics, who a lot of Catholics define themselves as Catholics, but they never go to church, or they go only when they get married or baptized or whatever. So that's different. Here, what we're talking about is people who are not only defining themselves as evangelicals, but that their religious experience is really part of who they are and how they live their lives.
Well, that's maybe a good point that I could ask then about, because, as you say, this spiritual intensity, if you will. We've seen that in America, where the evangelical Christians, they're seen as a very important voting group or voting bloc. And, they also play a significant role then in politics. How has that been seen then in Latin America, this growth of the evangelical movement? What kind of effect has that then had on the political landscape?
It's growing. So you have certain sites, Brazil, for instance, Costa Rica, where the evangelical bloc is really coherent and therefore has been able to put forward presidential candidates, such as in Costa Rica, or really like senatorial, a whole bloc in Senate as in Brazil. So it's growing in different parts of Latin America. In some places, Central America, it's very, very strong, very coherent. In other places that you could look at, so for instance, Ecuador, Bolivia, it's less coherent, but it is growing and it is there. In the US, what we have seen, and now with the Trump election, we really saw that, there is a core evangelical group that is quite coherent. It's even hierarchical. There are, of course, outliers in the US. And of course, I don't want to paint anyone, the whole movement with one single brush, because it's a complex thing in the US. But you kind of are able to see a core that is pushing and that supported the Trump candidacy. In Latin America, that's a bit harder to tell a narrative, a regional narrative, as coherent. Why? Because of social class differences. So because the evangelical movement in Latin America has become exponentially wider, it cuts now through social classes. And that means that then in certain places, you really do have, of course, a lot of evangelicals who are low income, but then you also have the elite who are also evangelicals. Some of them are evangelicals. And that, of course, makes it harder to have a common block in some of the issues. In other issues, you can see what we would call, quote unquote, cultural war issues. You see that there's more coherence. So the point there is, yes, the influence is growing. There is no doubt about that. Yes, there are certain places, Costa Rica, Brazil, for instance, where the evangelicals are very disciplined voters. There are other places where that is less clear. but not for lack of trying. So we can see that, like the whole thing is moving towards having an evangelical core of people voting. Somehow, like in the US. In Latin America, it's a bit more complicated because there's much more diversity within the evangelical bloc because it's such a wide movement.
That's right, and obviously covers a great deal of countries as well. Okay, but so we're saying that the evangelical movement is growing politically in power, both as a voting bloc, and you also mentioned there that presidential candidates and the Senate and the like as well are involved in politics. How then do evangelical Christians view the distinction between secular and religious when it comes to public discourse, and why do you think this is particularly important to understand?
I think that question, Chris, is really the defining question that we're having in Latin America right now. When I started writing these pieces, some of these articles, they're already even like 7 years old or so. When I started doing research for those articles, people were saying, but why? So why are you working on this? So we have all these problems. Who cares about this? So it's very hard, and particularly international lawyers. They're like, like that has nothing to do with the stuff we do.
That's right. As I say, I was completely surprised by this whole topic. That's why I found it so interesting. Wanted to talk about it because it seems that you hear about Latin America in a lot of other ways, but this was totally out there.
Exactly. It's a redefinition of the public sphere. And it's a redefinition of the public sphere that is happening from the bottom up. Originally, the Protestants, the historical churches in Latin America were considered absolutely outside of the public sphere in Latin America, completely excluded. Why? Because they were seen as the internal enemy, along with Freemasons and the Jewish population. So it was the same block, the same block of the Catholic majority, particularly the Catholic Church, saying, you have these Protestants, you have these Freemasons, you have the Jews, and these are outside the body politic, let's say. When we have the emergence of transformative constitutionalism in Latin America in the 1980s, 1990s, you have a wonderful set of developments in constitutions around the region that say, we need to protect religious diversity. And that we need to protect religious diversity means, on the one hand, we need to protect a traditional indigenous heritage. So that's one thing. It's less organized religion. It's a spiritual heritage that we have in Latin America that is very rich, that needs to be protected. And on the other hand, we need to have some kind of pluralism with regards to religion. In that context, so when the constitutional framework opened itself to this kind of religious pluralism, then the logic was a logic of protection, in the sense of, yes, we have this public sphere. This public sphere is not religious. We have then these new constitutions that have a very strong division between state and church. I'm referring to the early 1990s. Most of those constitutions were a reaction to the influence of church, of the Catholic Church in the state. And then most of these constitutions were saying, we have to, kind of limit the influence of the Catholic Church in the state. We have to draw this line. And part of drawing this line is to recognize religious pluralism. We have these other religions, and therefore we have the Protestants, we have the Evangelicals, we have, the Muslims, and then we need to protect them. They are not, and this is the second moment, they are part of our society, but their beliefs are their private beliefs. And their beliefs are part of what they do. They can do it at home. And then the role of the state is to protect their beliefs. Their beliefs they don't belong to the public sphere, but they belong to their private, to their homes, to their churches, whatever. And then the role of the state is, and this is, the standard transformative constitutionalist move, is to say the role of the state is to guarantee this pluralism. So kind of managing this kind of group. So if you have a church and then, you're playing your guitar too loud at 7 a.m. in the morning, so the state is supposed to come and tell you, no, you shouldn't do that because you have the right to worship, but other people have the right to sleep. Like this kind of very standard constitutional questions.
Basically to take the religion out of the politics on all sides and to protect minorities. Okay.
And protect minority religions.
Yeah.
But the third moment is a number of religions, and in this context that we're talking about here, evangelicals raise their hands and they say, but hold on a second, a lot of the things that I believe have a bearing in the public sphere. And I want to then, and here I'm kind of stylizing a narrative, but it really does play out, and some of the papers that you'll have tell this story in more detail. Particularly in the early 2000s, a lot of these evangelical groups and evangelical individuals were saying, look, I think that some of the issues that I believe belong in the public sphere, or at least I want them there to be discussed in the public sphere. And two things happened there. So on the one hand, because the evangelical experience is so deep and so fundamental to the person's life, evangelical believers were saying, look, don't ask me to check out my beliefs in the public sphere. So don't tell me that I need to be two people, one person in the private sphere.
I see, we're behind closed doors and then otherwise, yes, okay.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. That's unfair because this is a fundamental part of my life, of my vision of the life, of my own life experience. So there's this bottom-up organic pressure of saying, look, these are the beliefs I hold dear. Don't tell me that I can tell this, behind closed doors, but that suddenly I need to become something different when I'm in the public sphere. So there's this organic push, and these two things are not exclusive. And then also there is this strategic electoral and ideological move of evangelical leaders, conservative leaders, who see in this tension an opportunity to push certain issues of the agenda, typically, LGBTQI rights, also gender issues that are kind of cultural hotspots that perhaps are not that salient in people's own lives, but they see the connection and they say, look, and these are the things that we're going to write them, and we're going to write them to bring them to the public sphere, because this is going to give us political openings and political opportunities. So the latter does occur, and the latter is, politicians being politicians, that's what they do. But there is also a kind of organic bottom-up thing. It's not just, like manipulation or whatever. There is also this bottom-up thing of people for whom the religion experience is a fundamental part of their experience. And therefore, they're saying, look, this is something that if I'm going to vote, I'm going to vote on these issues. Don't tell me that I can't vote on these issues because these issues, you frame them as religious, because those are the main issues for me. So that combination then becomes, and this is then the last moment, let's say, this last moment is particularly evangelical groups in Latin America saying, look, what you're defining as the public sphere, we're pushing back against that. So this idea that the public sphere is something that necessarily excludes any kind of religious consideration or at least moral consideration, we're pushing back against that. And we're pushing back in the ballot boxes, and we're pushing back through strategic litigation.
That brings me to my next question, which would be about how the growth of the evangelical movement and their political power has affected human rights. I guess the rest of the podcast will be kind of looking at this now. But my understanding, and I think you've explained that there as well, that evangelicalism is a very spiritual movement with a somewhat traditionalist reading or an understanding of the Bible, and, as you also said, probably a more conservative understanding of Christian beliefs. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because if you talk about it from the theological perspective, a lot of the things that are being taught in Latin America as evangelical beliefs would give a heart attack to the pastor in your church or something like that. So it's a completely different thing. And that tension is very interesting. When you go into the theological and eschatological differences between the different branches of Protestantism, it's very, very different. But what it's undeniable is the conservative bend in the core, let's say, of the evangelical movement. That's undeniable. And particularly a conservative bend in hot cultural issues, particularly LGBTQI rights. There's no doubt about that. Of course, it's a white church, let's say. A lot of people fit in there. But in general, you can really see that tendency. That has really created a tension between LGBTQI rights in particular and the positions of many conservative evangelical movements. And that tension is a defining tension in two senses. And that's why I was telling you before that if you really think about it, this is really one of the key issues of defining how is the Latin American state going to look like in the future. Because then what you really have is on the one hand, a minority, the LGBTQI minority, telling the Latin American state, look, you have to keep your promise. Your promise is the protection. So your promise is you need to protect. You need to protect me. I have the right to A, B, and C. You need to deliver on that promise because it's not only me. It's the promise to everyone that looks at the conquests of the LGBTQI movement and say the state provides for everyone. So there is a space for all of us here. That's a promise, and that's a promise of transformative constitutionalism. But then on the other hand, you have a group of, not all again, but a sizable majority of very conservative evangelical groups saying, we want to define what's in the public sphere because you have the promise as well. You promise us, to be able to participate because we need to be protected in the context of the separation between church and the state.
Okay, so the state's being pulled at on all sides then from different minority groups, basically.
Exactly. But the problem there is, the challenge there is that it's not enough that the state says, all right, so you, LGBTQ community, are there, here to my left, and then you, evangelical Protestants, are to my right here, and then I'll ponder these two conflicts and I'll try to manage this, because the challenge is that this conflict reflects a debate on the nature of the state itself, who defines where is the line of the public sphere. So that's why this challenge really, it's a challenge, if you want, is a contest for the soul of the state in Latin America.
Okay. Well, let's go to a quick break then, René, but that's a nice point to end on there. As I say, it's a challenge for the soul of the state in Latin America. Well, to my listeners, don't go away. I'm going to be back with René shortly. We're going to then break down how one can foster then dialogue between these evangelical parties, non-evangelical parties, various parties that we've all heard about here now. And we're also going to touch more on the role of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights.
Allow us to introduce you to the wealth of information found on the Max Planck Law website. Discover a range of events, from researcher-led presentations and reading groups to workshops and conferences, many of which are open to the public. Keep up to date with our news, explore the tangible impacts of our research, and peruse Perspectives, our online publication offering insightful articles on current legal issues. And of course, for those looking to pursue a PhD or postdoctoral research, you will find everything you need to know about our many academic opportunities. Visit our website today, law.mpg.de.
Well, welcome back to the Max Planck Lawcast. I'm joined today by René Urueña, and we are talking all about the relationship between evangelicalism, politics, and human rights in Latin America. So, René, we heard a lot before the break about the growth of evangelicalism and this kind of push and pull now that currently exists in Latin America between the state, the evangelical movement, and as well other movements. We talked in particular about the LGBTQ movement. I'd like to now, I guess, look more. I mean, we talked a little bit about the influence of evangelicalism there on human rights across the region. I'd like to ask what strategies can be employed to foster dialogue between evangelicals and other religious, political, and social movements? Because, as you said, it's clearly not straightforward what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, so that's a huge challenge because there are, let's say, two dimensions to this. So on the one hand, the Latin American state, and particularly the Latin American constitutional state, must deliver on its promise to the LGBTQI community. So there's no way around it. And it needs to do so, well, first, because we're talking about their rights. It's not a favor, it's not a benefit, it's not an entitlement. It is a set of rights that have been recognized by not only the constitution of the different states, but also by the Inter-American System of Human Rights. And we can talk later about the Inter-American System. So there is a legal guarantee there that needs to be delivered on. So that's on the one hand we have.
That's set in stone. We have a legal guarantee that has to be protected. That's right, yeah.
Exactly. We have that. They need to be protected. So that part cannot be negotiated, let's say. And that's why I was so adamant earlier on saying it's not that we have a referee state, we're having two sides that have a moral equivalent in that sense, because we do have like a basic guarantee of rights. And then on the other hand, the protection of the basic rights of the evangelical church in that sense It's different because the discussion there is not whether and to what extent they're able to worship, they're able to have their own rights, their own beliefs, because those guarantees are being protected. So basically, in that sense, we don't have a moral equivalent in that sense. What we have is the challenge for the state that it needs to, on the one, deliver on the rights that have been guaranteed for the LGBTQI community. That's on the one hand. But then at the same time, it needs also to give an answer to the people who are saying, well, I need something beyond the mere protection of rights in terms of the political existence of my own spiritual life. So in that sense, it's not exactly a matter of pondering rights in this point, but it's a matter of how do we protect rights that need to be protected while at the same time opening political spaces for, let's say, a diverse political experience that includes people's morality. That's the way I frame the discussion. There are other scholars who say, no, this is a matter of set of rights of minorities against the other set of rights of minorities. My framing, at least in the pieces that I shared with you, are not that exactly. So what we have is we need to protect a minority whose very basic rights are being threatened on the one hand, and that needs to be, let's say, the starting point of this conversation.
That's the LGBTQ minority in this case, yes, okay.
Exactly. There needs to be a clear constitutional line in terms of saying, look, this is something that we need, that we cannot go back in those terms. So that needs to be clear. However, because this is not just a matter of, defense of a soccer team saying A and defense of a soccer team saying B, but rather it's a matter of a group of people who are trying to redefine what is it that goes into the public sphere, then while guaranteeing those rights, the Latin American state needs to create the political spaces for people to be able to say, look, my beliefs are being considered as part of the public sphere, but while they are being considered as part of the public sphere, they are still being limited by the language of rights. That's kind of the angle that I'm proposing. My framing then implies two different things. First, that there is no actual conflict of rights in most of these issues, because what we have is rights and political interests. So we need to protect rights. There's no doubt about that. And by rights, I mean the rights of the LGBTQI community. There's no doubt about that. But then at the same time, because this is really, as I was saying before, this is really a debate on the limits of the public sphere in Latin America, then the Latin American political discourse needs to open up spaces for this kind of moral reasoning to be part of the public sphere and being limited by fundamental rights and constitutional rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about fundamental there, and that kind of reminds me, when I was reading your text, there was a word which stuck out to me as secular fundamentalism, and you warn against secular fundamentalism. What do you actually mean by this, and what's the concern here when balancing the relationship between religion, politics, and human rights?
So this idea of secular fundamentalism, it comes from a body of literature precisely on the interaction between religion and state and religious manifestations. And the idea and the reason why I warn against this idea is precisely in the conceptual framework that I was describing before, which is, look, I mean, while we need to protect fundamental rights, and that's the starting point, the idea that the public sphere only includes secular arguments, or the other way around, the idea that the public sphere in society necessarily needs to exclude religious arguments is a problem. That's a huge problem. And that idea, the idea that the public sphere should never include religious reasoning, that idea is the idea that I refer to as secular fundamentalism. And why is that? And why do I warn against that idea? I warn against that idea precisely because, in the context of evangelical Protestantism in Latin America, that implies, and one needs to take that seriously, that implies that one is condemning people to have dual lives, and that part of the actual reasons, the actual fundamental necessary causal reasons for most of their lives somehow are excluded from the public sphere. And that, of course, invites bad faith arguments, because then I think something. Why? Because I am religious, whatever religion, in this case, evangelical Protestantism, and I think that, and I take my decisions based on that. And then when I participate in the public sphere, then this idea that religious arguments are foreign or need to be excluded from the public sphere, then that pushes me then to hide my motivations and make a bad faith argument in the sense of saying, I know that I think this, but now I'm going to argue this on this basis and this basis and this basis, which I know it's not true, but because of this line, that pushes me to do that. This argument doesn't mean that all religious arguments are acceptable in the public sphere. It just means that while those arguments can be expressed in and of themselves in the public sphere, there are limits to the effect of those arguments, and those limits are, of course, constitutional rights. So we have the vocabulary of rights. So while this may sound complicated and different to strike the balance, we already have a very rich vocabulary to speak about these kind of things. On the one hand, we have the vocabulary on freedom of speech. We know that there is certain speech that is not acceptable in particular societies due to particular reasons. And we know, so in the public sphere, and we know that there is certain speech that might be offensive, but needs to be recognized as part of the public sphere. Does that mean that policy must be adopted on the basis of that speech that is offensive? No, we know that that's not the case. We have certain kind of criteria to understand that. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, something that I suggest in some of these articles is in the Latin American context, we also have a very rich vocabulary of taking people's religious and spiritual lives seriously, which is the case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights related to indigenous rights and indigenous cosmovisions. So we know there is a whole vocabulary of pluralism in Latin American constitutional law that speaks of how do we deal with people who take a different cosmology and they decide their lives on the basis of that. How do we deal with that in the sense that we recognize that pluralism while at the same time we kind of manage society on the basis of human rights? Of course, it's not perfect. It's very complicated. I'm not saying that this works perfectly, but we do have the vocabulary. So that's kind of the point there. The point there is that somehow, and that's kind of the second dimension that I was telling you before. While recognizing and protecting human rights, there's no doubt about that, we have the opening, the political opening for this kind of vocabulary to exist in the public sphere, while at the same time being tamed by fundamental rights. And we already have some vocabulary to talk about.
Okay. So basically the state shouldn't shy away from hearing voices from all parties. There should be no secular fundamentalism, as you say, if there are religious, spiritual beliefs or issues that the members of the faith would like to raise, the state should hear these, but the effect of those will have to be then decided by law.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, let's put the law into Lawcast. We have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. This is a regional human rights court in Latin America with jurisdiction over 35 countries in the Americas. It's, as I learned for this podcast, responsible for interpreting and applying the American Convention on Human Rights, and it can issue binding judgments that require countries to take specific actions to protect human rights. I'd like to now kind of put it to you. I know that evangelicals have been engaging with the court. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how they've done this and what they've been seeking to achieve and what they have perhaps achieved?
So that's a really key question and a fun, like a hot issue right now in this debate. So the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, as you said, it's really in the center, or it's a key part of a wider set of common human rights standards that permeate the whole Latin American region. Armin Fonk-Bondandi and Mariela Morales at the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg, they have coined the notion of jus constitutionale comune in Latin America, or ICAL for short. And that idea is really that there is this common human rights law in Latin America that actually has an impact in the way in which issues are being framed and understood in the region. The idea there, and from this perspective, the idea is that law is supposed to transform reality, to affect deep structures of power. And that's why we call that transformative constitutionalism in Latin America, this idea.
When you say transform, you mean positively transform.
Exactly, positive transform. Exactly, yeah. So the idea is that on the one hand, we have this common law, so this ICAL, this common law of human rights in the region, but that common law in the region is a way of understanding law that wants to frame very deep social challenges as legal issues, as legal challenges. So you might have, deep social inequality, armed conflict, climate change, and that those kind of things, those kind of very deep structural challenges in society can be understood and can be, constructively framed as legal challenges. And something can be done about it. Not everything can be done through law, obviously, that's clear, but something can be constructively be done through law.
And they can be confined, as legal challenges that affect human rights.
Exactly. The vocabulary to frame those issues is the vocabulary of human rights. And now with regards to this huge challenge that we're discussing here, this challenge of how to bring some very different views of the world to the public sphere. So obviously, that's one of the issues that can be thought productively through law as part of transformative constitutionalism. And that's why in Latin America, then the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is really called to have a huge role in this context.
How can it then navigate these demands that are being placed on it?
It's huge. So on the one hand, what I perceive is three different moves. And this is happening as we speak. On the one hand, what you see is both evangelicals and human rights organizations, they want to influence adjudication at the Inter-American Court. So they want to use the vocabulary, which is the vocabulary of human rights, which, as you know, is open-ended. It provides for interpretation, so on and so forth. They are mobilizing very, very fast to do strategic litigation, both at the domestic constitutional level and at the Inter-American level. There is an emergence of a fascinating dimension to this, which is the emergence of a very active conservative legal movement in Latin America that is taking a page out of the book of more progressive legal mobilization of the 1990s, and they are kind of following the same strategies of doing strategic litigation, of trying to do shadow reports, of going before the Inter-American Commission or the Inter-American Court to file either reports or amici briefs. So all this kind of strategic legal mobilization from the bottom up. So that's the first dimension. We're seeing that. So a group of people very motivated, some of them extremely sophisticated, a lot of funding coming one way or the other for this discussion. And then in order to have their views crystallized as human rights standards, particularly at the Inter-American level. And why? Well, because if you crystallize your standard at the Inter-American level, because of this common law of human rights that we were discussing before, that's going to have, of course, a wider diffusion effect throughout the region. So that's a very important debate that is happening now. Cases do take a while to go through the Inter-American system because they need to go first to the commission and then to the court, but a lot of these discussions are happening there. And if you actually look at some of the big cases of LGBTQI rights, then you're going to see that a lot of conservative evangelical groups filed amici briefs. They're saying, look, we believe this, we believe that, and trying to influence the decision-making of the court. So that's one thing. Legal mobilization, bottom-up, but funded, very transnational, very, for those of our listeners who work on legal mobilization, international law from below, these kind of things, that's exactly what's happening. Or the judicialization of politics. So that's really happening there. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, while this is happening, the Inter-American Court has a very rich case law of the relation between religion and human rights. So we have cases that are very rich in terms of giving a very reasonable pathway of how to balance and how to live in a democracy of people who are religious. So, because the goal cannot be that in order to have functioning democracies in Latin America, then suddenly people need to become atheists.
That's back to the secular fundamentalism. It's obviously not going to work.
Exactly. That's not going to work. That's not fair. That's most likely not constitutional. And most importantly, that's not going to work out. It's as simple as that. But the Inter-American Court has some interesting ideas there, provides interesting vocabulary, not focus only on gender issues and these kind of hot cultural issues, but on thinking more structurally about the role of religious discourse in the public sphere. And in this second point, the Inter-American Court has also the world's most advanced case law and jurisprudence on the recognition on indigenous rights. It's as simple as that. So we have a huge vocabulary there.
And you feel that that experience and vocabulary can then be used with these new challenges as well?
I think so. So obviously it needs to be adapted. There's a whole discussion on how, so a lot of issues don't travel well. And of course, we're not talking, it's not the same thing, but the idea that people's spiritual views can and are relevant for the public sphere under a human rights framework, that idea is something that we can build on. And it needs to be adapted. So this, on the one hand, the Inter-American Court's case law on religious discourse, in the Inter-American Court's case law on indigenous rights. Of course, there is a whole set of indigenous rights that are not going to be relevant here. Prior consultation, titling of territories, of course, that's a different thing. But the idea, this is what I'm trying to get at, the idea that people's spiritualities, whatever they are relevant and should be respected in a framework of human rights, I think that's very relevant. And of course, and this is the last point on this second dimension, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has also very interesting, and the Inter-American system in general, have also very sophisticated standards on freedom of speech. There is a special rapporteur on freedom of speech in the Inter-American system of human rights. There are only two special rapporteurs in the Inter-American Commission, freedom of speech, or freedom of expression, and socioeconomic rights and environmental rights. There have been a number of rapporteurs who have done a wonderful work, giving us a vocabulary to think, what can we do in democracies where, of course, there are some of them very fragile. So it's not that we need to open the public sphere as a suicide strategy, like that we do this and then we won't have a functioning democracy anymore. There is a number of strategies that have been tried there in terms of how do we protect the freedom of speech in a context in which we want to give a space for people to say what they really believe, even if we find it offensive. And we have vocabulary for that.
Yeah, no, I think you said that that's quite interesting because it's so diverse as well. So many countries. I mean, the challenges are obviously enormous, but nonetheless not insurmountable. Unfortunately, René, we're going to have to wrap it up now, but I've got one final question for you. We've seen a lot about the growing influence of the evangelical religious movement. What do you see as the key challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in Latin America?
Well, I think there are a couple of huge challenges around this issue. So the first one is, of course, there's a connection between many, not all again, but many evangelical conservative movements and populism. So there is a connection there, which is undeniable as well. So a lot of the electoral power that some of these ideas have gathered derive from very sophisticated political operation in terms of bringing people to vote, in terms of having very specific contacts with very specific groups. And then that, of course, around the idea that somehow you have these elites and that these elites don't recognize me as I am. And one part of what I am is I am evangelical. And then what we have, so that's the first big challenge, what we have is the risk, and it's an important risk, the risk of the human rights vocabulary that we were discussing before to be perceived as an elitist vocabulary that is being applied or imposed upon a group of people who just want to be what they are. And then that's a formula for populism. We have seen it in many places lately. So that's a huge challenge. We don't want for the evangelical Protestantism, the issue in Latin America, to become one and the same with the issue of populism. This is something that we want to prevent. And why? Because the structure of that challenge is that the human rights vocabulary then becomes part of the elite. And that's something that we absolutely don't want. That is why, for instance, I sometimes am very cautious and skeptical when people say that some of these movements are anti-rights. That this is an anti-rights movement. I mean, this is a vocabulary that exists in Latin America, but I'm very skeptical and I'm very cautious because you don't want the language of rights to be interpreted as the language of an elite saying to people, this is something that you can't do. This is something that you can't be, because that's a huge risk in terms of populism. So that's one important challenge. The second important challenge that I see there is the interface between religious discourse and social media. And particularly the way in which social media of course, expands or risks to expand misinformation, disinformation. So, and how these kind of discourses exist somehow under the radar, or at least in terms that are very difficult to catch through a vocabulary of human rights. So this whole discussion that we were having just 5 minutes ago, that sounds great. But when we're talking about misinformation in social media, a lot of this doesn't translate very well. So we might have the standards, but as a matter of practice, we might have issues of content moderation, so on and so forth, that I think we're not giving it as much thought in terms of the sophistication of the tool. We think that it's just one thing more, and I think it isn't. And we need to think of it.
And when you say content moderation and the like, who would then be responsible though for moderating that content?
Exactly. We need to think in those terms. So one possible answer that we see is what Meta did. They created their oversight board that has, there are friends, there are enemies to that model, but it is a model. We have, of course, Mr. Musk, whose model is to have no model of content moderation at all. So some courts in Latin America, for instance, the Colombian Constitutional Court, have adopted case law saying, look, this is the way you can go around this. These are possible standards. Again, the Inter-American Commission, the special rapporteur, has some reports on that. And I think that's useful. But I think when we have that connection of religious discourse and the speed implied in social media, I think that we need new ideas there. We need to think this more. And those ideas are not forthcoming. And I think that's something that we need to sit down, your listeners, and I'm trying to work on this. We need to think better on how this conversation, we went all the way from the 19th century in Latin America. And all this vocabulary is great, but I think now we're kind of opening to a new dawn that I don't think we're understanding very well, particularly in the connection between social media and religious discourse in Latin America.
And what about opportunities then? I mean, to end on, I guess, a positive note, I mean, there are opportunities here for cultural and spiritual dialogue, right? I mean, we shouldn't see it all as negative here.
No, there is. So this whole conversation, and the fact that you and I, that we're having this conversation, it allows us, and it allows Latin American democracies to bring to the fore the need for a more flexible vocabulary to really understand how is it that we're thinking about our democracies. So Latin America emerged from dictatorships and then a very deep structural socioeconomic troubles in which the vocabulary of human rights were fundamental to kind of keep the rule of law together. So, and we have that. But as these democracies become more and more sophisticated, as different constituencies in the different countries, they're raising their hands and they're saying, I want recognition, I want to say what's important for our society, then we need to develop a human rights vocabulary and a constitutional vocabulary that at the same time protects the core of what we know is important. We don't want to go back, but at the same time, that provides a pathway for Latin American democracies that is their own pathway, that is not something that is transplanted, but it's rather created organically and through law. That's the whole intervention, I think.
Okay, so whilst we have to protect what is fundamental, we also have to be flexible about how we do it.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, René, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. I mean, I learned so much, so thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And I should note that you have, as you also mentioned during the podcast, a range of publications on the issue as a pioneer on the research of this area. I'm going to link those in the podcast description, so listeners who'd like to know more can happily go there and have a read on the topic. So, René, I think that's it from my side. Thank you so much again for being on the Lawcast today.
Chris, thank you so much for having me. I mean, this was fun, and it's fun to talk about all these kind of things. And congratulations on this wonderful podcast of Max Planck Law. I think Max Planck Law in general is doing a wonderful job foregrounding these various diverse research that's happening all around the Max Planck network. So really, congratulations and keep up the good work.
Thank you, René. Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.